Hello and welcome to the EU External Anti-Corruption Promotion, a case study on Moldova. I'm Eliana.
And I'm Mihai.
From the Moldovan German Forum, a Chisinau-based non-governmental organization whose aim is to enhance the European integration process in Moldova.
In 5 podcast episodes, we discuss corruption and EU efforts against corruption in Moldova. This research project is supported by the Institut für Europaeische Politik within the framework of the Eurasia Lab and Fellowship Program.
In this first episode, Playing with Fire, Corruption in Moldova, we are going to illustrate the extent of corruption in the country and its devastating effects regarding market economy, foreign direct investments, and even migratory flows. Before diving into the more technical part of our conversation, I would like us to briefly introduce Moldova to our listeners. Not everyone may know much about the country, although it is right at the EU's eastern borders, landlocked between Romania and Ukraine.
Yes, but I would say that today the probability of meeting someone from Western Europe who has never heard of the existence of Moldova or does not know where it is located is considerably lower than it was, let's say, 15 years ago. Unfortunately, however, the majority of media coverage is pretty negative, or at least not particularly flattering. It also doesn't necessarily reflect the reality in the country.
Well, wine lovers may know that this small country, which is just slightly bigger than Belgium, with a population almost as large as the one of Berlin, it is the 19th biggest wine producer in the world. But indeed, the headlines of media in the EU rather portray Moldova as the poorest and most corrupt country in Europe, with a considerably high diaspora and a huge brain drain.
200,000 people left in the last 15 years only.
Yes, and it's worth mentioning here that almost half of the country's youth wishes to leave because of corruption.
Well, the existence of corruption today actually to a large extent can be explained by the fact that Moldova was part of the Soviet Union up until 1991, when it gained its independence on the 27th of August. This is important for 2 reasons. Well, first, corruption was inherent to the Soviet Union century plan economy. Dependency on personal contacts and bribes, for instance, were coping mechanisms to overcome shortages of basic goods. And second, and I think even most important, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the already challenging political, economic, social, and also legal transformation process was additionally hampered by the former communist elites, which actually misused the privatization process to make personal gains. And today, nearly 30 years later, Moldova is a young and relatively inexperienced democracy, a state captured by oligarchic interests with a concentration of economic and political power in the hands of a small group of people.
The driving forces behind this corruption trend were Moldova's most powerful and omnipresent oligarch, Vladimir Plahotniuc, and his ruling Democratic Party of Moldova. Without occupying an elective mandate, Plahotniuc has been dominating the Moldovan political landscape since 2010. He infiltrated the Democratic Party, positioned people that were loyal to him in crucial state institutions, transformed Moldova's state structures into rent-seeking instruments, and established an entrenched, mafia-like oligarchy. By the end of 2016, Plahotniuc's Democratic Party had become the uncontested ruling party in Moldova. And to put the extent of corruption in the country in concrete terms, in 2016, the loss of GDP due to corruption was higher than all the expenses for pensions and social security in that year. In 2017, over 40% of the population declared to have paid a bribe in public services, and the volume of those bribes are higher than all the expenses on roads in that year. This clearly affects Moldovan citizens' trust in public institutions and deters foreign investments. According to recent surveys from 2010, one-third of firms in Moldova admit to have experienced bribe requests.
Well, yeah, that's right. And at the same time, corruption is not only a challenge for Moldova and its citizens, but it has also negative effects for the region and consequently stands against the EU's interests of the security and stability at its borders. And this is evidenced by the Russian laundromat and the banking fraud scandal, as a result of which the EU was penetrated by criminal networks.
Yes, to money laundering schemes with outstanding extents. Why don't we go a bit more into detail?
Yeah, that's actually a very good idea. Sure. The Russian Landromat was a fraud scheme to move $70 billion out of Russia between 2010 and 2014, laundering them through Moldovan and also EU banks. And the second money laundering scheme is the banking fraud scandal, or also known as the theft of the century, which was an elaborate carousel borrowing scheme where loans at one of the three banks involved were paid with money from loans at the other two banks under the guise of government guarantees. And this led to the disappearance of the equivalent of 1 billion US dollars from the Moldovan banking system in 2014, no less than 12% of the Moldovan GDP. EU officials couldn't really understand how it was possible to steal so much money from such a small country. And it was achieved through a web of toxic loans, asset swaps, fraud, and corruption schemes, with the complicity of the political elite and the judicial system.
It is no surprise that so many Moldovans lack trust in democratically elected officials, and they cite the judiciary among the foremost corrupt institutions in the country. And the consequences of what you just described were even more far reaching. After the theft, the Moldovan leu depreciated so much that a quarter of the population became poorer by a quarter. Moreover, after 2 years of fruitless attempts to bring those responsible to justice and recover the stolen assets from the banking fraud, in 2016 the Moldovan government decided to recover the money through higher taxes, thus putting the burden on ordinary citizens. But the damage did not end there. The billion-dollar theft had serious consequences for Moldova's relations with the EU. Most important, while it was not possible to prove that EU funds were misappropriated specifically by the banking fraud, as these funds were merged with the overall state budget, the EU drastically changed both discourse and policy action vis-à-vis Moldova.
Yes, officials made unequivocally clear that they saw high level corruption as a factor that seriously endangers EU reform efforts aimed at tackling domestic structural problems in the country and also threatens the integrity of EU funding and EU financial interests. And these issues were of such concern that they were explicitly and publicly raised by the head of the EU delegation to Moldova at that time, Pirca Tapiola. During a news conference in 2015, presenting the report on the progress of the Republic of Moldova within the European Neighborhood Policy 2014, he said, and I quote, "I've said it. If there is no progress, there will not be a tranche." While we are very committed to supporting the Republic of Moldova, one of the key issues is macroeconomic stability and the transparency of the budgetary process. We are interested in how to build guarantees into the system that the transparency of the budgetary system is such that our budget support goes really to what this budget support is needed for, and that's reforms and taking this country forward. Without transparency, if there would be any risk that money of European taxpayers, and I know many of these taxpayers myself and I'm accountable to them, there are single mothers, there are not wealthy people whose tax money goes to supporting Moldova's path of reform. But if there would be a risk that any of these fundings could end up basically indirectly going into the pockets of those who have caused problems in the banking sector and who have taken money from the banks as part of the support program, and these issues are not dealt with, then, of course, we have a serious accountability problem which can affect also the basis of being able to disperse, especially budgetary support.
A few months later, in July 2015, the EU actually practiced what it had preached and suspended its main aid delivery method, budgetary support worth 40 million euro. Also, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank decided to freeze financial assistance to Moldova.
Well, besides these two major banking fraud schemes, another example of high-level grand political corruption, but in a very different field, was the changing of the electoral code by the Moldovan parliament from a proportional system to a mixed system in 2017. Well, you see, before these changes, Moldova had a proportional system with a nationwide constituency. This means that every party had a party list, and when people went to vote, they voted the party list. After the changes to the electoral code at the February 2019 parliamentary elections, besides voting party lists, people additionally voted individual candidates directly. And for that purpose, Moldova was divided into single-member constituencies, where different candidates affiliated to political party or not competed for a seat in parliament. As a consequence, 50 of the 101 members of parliament were voted via party lists, and the other 51 were voted in their constituencies. The official reasoning behind these changes of the electoral code was to increase participatory democracy by increasing the proximity between the electorate and their representatives in parliament.
How so?
Well, you would have the deputies feeling directly responsible towards their constituents, like it happens, for example, in Germany, where MEPs spend 1 week in the parliament and another week in their constituencies.
Or like in the US. But I'm thinking the fact that it works well in Germany or in the US does not necessarily mean that it does everywhere else, and especially not in a country such as Moldova, where, as we said, showed corruption is endemic and maybe lacking the basic conditions for such a system to thrive.
Yes, exactly. And this is, by the way, how the Venice Commission and the ODIHR, which is the OC Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, saw it. They released not one, but two joint opinions in 2014 and 2017, where they expressed serious concerns towards the mixed electoral system.
As the Venice Commission and the ODIHR only have the power to issue legally non-binding recommendation, serious concerns was basically the loudest whistles that they could blow.
Moldovan officials declared that they would have followed the advice, except that for a few months later, plot twist. A large majority composed of the Democratic Party and the Socialist Party adopted the mixed electoral system in parliament, seeking to put themselves in a favorable position for the upcoming elections. And their plan seemed to have worked out well. Socialists and Democrats gained 55 seats in parliament, which didn't seem possible before.
Wow.
In fact, polls before the elections made the entry of the Democratic Party into parliament reasonably doubtful.
But how exactly was this possible?
Well, the 51 single-mandate constituencies offered favorable conditions for the misuse of state resources by the incumbent regime, corruption of poverty-stricken voters, vote buying, untransparent campaign financing, and fake so-called independent candidates. And oftentimes, these were popular local figures who were careful not to use the highly unpopular brand of the Democratic Party, but were secretly financed by it.
And all these issues were later confirmed by international observers. Now, this case exemplifies that the electoral process is a high-risk area for corruption. Its integrity, transparency, and accountability are vital for the legitimacy of the electoral outcome, and ultimately the very functioning of democracy.
However, and this may be surprising to some, despite the importance of this topic, the EU's toolbox in the area of illegal party funding is extremely underdeveloped, both internally vis-à-vis EU member states and externally in its relations towards Moldova, which is something that we will discuss more in depth later.
For now, we have arrived at the end of our first episode. We described Moldova through a corruption lens, discussing two of the biggest money laundering schemes in Eastern Europe. We have also discussed another example of high-level corruption, the changing of the electoral code, which allowed money to influence the electoral outcome. What we have tried to show is that corruption is deeply rooted in Moldova and that it influences internal developments and its relations with the EU. Thank you for taking time out of your day to listen to our podcast. If you have learned something new today, please share this episode with your network or tell a friend about it. If you would like to cooperate with us or have a burning question you need answered, you can reach us at info@fmg.md.
In our next episode, we will explore the key external anti-corruption actors in the country, the European Union and the Council of Europe. Talk to you next time.